behind every high mountain in the Highlands, there are legends and stories, many of them true. And that's what brings me here to the source of Scotland's greatest river, the Tay, which discharges more water into the sea than any other British river. It rises on Ben Louis, and on one side of the mountains, the streams go to the Atlantic. On the other side, the streams flow east, reaching through the country known as Breadalbanes, the heights of Alba. And it's a country where history has been hammered out, and along its course, the story of Scotland can be traced over 500 years. The first name we hear is St. Fillan, an Irish saint who came from the west to spread the word amongst the Picts along the course of the Tay, because that was the heart of Pict land, and that's where our journey begins. It's a bit more of a gentle glen now, and in early days folk pastured their cattle up here in the summer. Now above the river, which is called the Coninish but is really the Tay, there's a bit of a track serving a lonely sheep farm and forestry plantations. When St. Fillan came here in the 8th century, all this would be Caledonian pine forest, and the folk living in the clearings amongst it would have to watch out for wolves and brown bears. There's still an odd fragment of the ancient forest left above Coninish, but the most famous name associated with the source of the Tay is Robert the Bruce. That wee loch in a way commemorates him, for around it the ground is known as Dal Ree, the King's Field, a battlefield where Bruce narrowly escaped being killed 8 years before Bannockburn. His fortunes were at a low ebb then. He was in the run when his men were beset by the Clan MacDougall. 3 of them came at Bruce. He killed 2. The 3rd had a grip on his plaid and nearly threw him from his horse. Now, St. Fillan had been dead over 600 years when Bruce came here, but there was a monastery around where St. Fillan had a chapel, and it's believed that Bruce took sanctuary with the monks and was given the blessing of St. Fillan. Bruce believed that his escape at the hands of the MacDougall was because of that blessing, and he attributed his success at Bannockburn to a holy relic of St. Fillan. So these stones go back a very long time, but this graveyard tells us there must have been an even older foundation, for in the Roman Catholic Church, a graveyard would be on the other side of the priory, the north side being reserved for evildoers. This raised mound in Glendochart with this stone in it is called Suey, and it's the Gaelic for seat, Fillan's seat, because when he moved from below Ben Louis, he was moving east to spread the Christian word. He used to gather people round him here, and of course he healed people as well. No doubt this seat had a special significance for the MacNabs when they made the small mound one of their burial places. Their clan name comes from Macanaba, meaning the children of the abbot. Apparently there were lay abbots 1,000 years ago who took wives and supported families, their progeny spreading from Dalmally west of Ben Louis right round past the priory of Strathfillan to the Dochart. And the Dochart was a river route of invasion. In fact, it was the way northward for Bruce after his defeat near Perth. To get here, he marched by Lochern and over Glenogle, turning left for the sanctuary of Fillan. but he found enmity instead, for the MacNabs joined with the MacDougals in the attack below Ben Louis. The MacNabs also fought against them at Bannockburn, and for that they forfeited their lands, but they were restored to them in 20 years, and the clan flourished. The present chief still lives in Culin, but his family is the only one with the name of MacNab today. St Fillan is better remembered, for until comparatively recently, on St Fillan's Day, no work was done on the 20th of January. St Fillan used to have a preaching place here at Culin. He's credited with building the very first meal mill on this river, which is the Tay, although here it's called the Dochart. And inside the mill are these stones in the traditional place. And it's reckoned these stones have been here for 1200 years. And there was always a hereditary keeper who administered the healing power of the stones. This one, for example, was for anything to do with the brain. If you had a mental illness or had terrible pains that were causing you agonizing trouble, the ritual was they were passed 3 times round your face one way, 3 times the other way. And whether it worked or not, we've no way of knowing. I suppose it would be a kind of faith healing. This one was for breast troubles in women. If it was applied to the breast, a cure could be expected. And if you had pains in the stomach, this flat one was rubbed round in a certain way. Pains in the back, this one, presumably because it looks like a backbone, so each stone had its purpose. Well, they're not used today, but the tradition is carried on of every Christmas Eve, the custodian of the stone comes to the riverside and he scatters the old rushes back into the river and collects new rushes, but they must have been cast up with the stream. They mustn't have been cut. Now we come to the family that was to become the most powerful in Scotland, the Campbells of Glenorchy, who come into the picture in 1432, when the ancestor of the Duke of Argyll gave his son Colin lands which had been forfeited from the MacGregors, and they raised this castle, Kilchurn, on an island at the head of Loch Awe. Its 5-storey tower was built while Colin was away on the Crusades. He was away for 7 years. He wasted no time on his return, expanding first of all to the lands near St Fillan's Priory, which he bought. Then came a grant of lands from the king at Lors and Loch Tay, from where he was able to consolidate by taking over the vital east end of Loch Tay, the port, where in time the Campbells built a castle where there had been a MacGregor castle. To say the family flourished would be an understatement. That castle of Ballach was built by Grey Colin in 1550, a forerunner to the splendid castle called Taymouth, lying empty today, but still a considerable monument to their wealth. Its interior decoration has been called some of the finest examples of Gothic art in Britain. Begun in 1801, it was completed in its present form on the eve of Queen Victoria and Albert's visit in 1842. Holyrood was considered to be too shabby for the royal couple. The Banner Hall, 50 feet long and with vaulted ceiling, shows the arms of the numerous families connected with the Breadalbanes. I wonder who was sitting in these seats on the most splendid night in the whole history of the Breadalbane family. It was an autumn night in 1842. The castle had been newly completed. The dining room was being used for the first time. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert must have been looking down on the nobility of Scotland, who would be here? Well, there could have been a duke, maybe a choice of 3 duchesses, some marchionesses, at least 3 countesses, the Marquis. Well, there were so many folk here and so much going on outside because this was the first time in 20 years that the royal family had been to Scotland, and it was Queen Victoria's first visit. George IV had paid a visit 20 years earlier, the first visit by a reigning monarch for 150 years. And of course the Scots had a bad image after the 45. Now Queen Victoria was seeing this country and fell in love with it immediately. And she wrote in her diary that it was like a feudal lord of long ago receiving her sovereign. And that love for Scotland remained with her for the whole of her life. The national anthem was playing and 10,000 spectators watching as the royal barge sailed under the bridge out in Loch Tay for Culin. The Queen wrote in her diary, reflections of hills, rocks, trees and clouds on the placid surface were perfect from Loch Tay to Glenogle. It was 24 years before she saw Taymouth again. Albert had died, so had the Marquis and Marchioness of Breadalbane, and this is where the Breadalbanes lie buried, at Finlarrig. They had no children, and commissioners were managing the estate because the succession was in dispute. This ruinous castle is indeed a truer monument to the Breadalbanes than the noble palace where Queen Victoria and Albert stayed. It tells the beginning and the end of a 500-year-old story. Historian Archie McKerracher has studied it in depth.
Finlarrig was built by Black Duncan of the Cowl round about 1600. He was called of the Cowl because he wore this black skull cap, which gave him a very frightening expression, and he was a very frightening man. He was grim, greedy, and utterly ruthless. He had a beheading pit at Finlarrig where the people of higher rank were beheaded with an axe, and the lower folk were hanged. He was given powers by the king to virtually hunt down and exterminate the clan MacGregor. He hunted them for bounty money, and in fact he made so much money that the king got rather angry and demanded that he should be given a share of the money. The MacGregor men, their heads were brought in for payment. The MacGregor women were branded in the forehead and sent down to the borders as serfs, and the children were herded into a barn on Loch Tayside to starve to death. Black Duncan died in his bed at the age of 83, but 40 years later, the MacNabs and the MacGregors had their revenge when they swept down with Montrose and they decimated the Breadalbane lands, and only one house is left standing along the length of Loch Tayside. The second and third earls in the 18th century were great land improvers. They built mills, they sent lieutenant sons to England to study modern agriculture methods. They introduced flax and spinning, and opened up lead mines at Tyndrum, and abolished the old inefficient Highland way of farming, built Kenmore as a model village, and let the houses rent-free to tradesmen. And over that period, up to 1830, this whole era became very prosperous indeed. A curse was placed on the Breadalbane family by a local woman, the Lady of Lors. There was bad blood between her and John, the first Earl. And she said to him, John of the three Johns, the worst that has come or will come. And she said to him that the title, your title, will never pass beyond a grandson in one line. Our final prophecy about the Breadalbanes was that in time the estates would only yield one rent and then none at all, and the last laird would go over Glenogle with nothing but a grey pony.
And in time, the trees will wrench apart the stones of Finlarrig as surely as the events of history split the family fortunes of the Breadalbanes, who finished up here at Cannell House. Jimmy Anderson was gardener to them there, and he kept a diary of events as they occurred, none more strange than his part in the last act of the drama, predicted by the Lady of Lors 300 years earlier.
I was standing at the yard over there at Cannell, talking to the forester, John McNabb. And the Countess arrived from Fillan station, sitting in a little carriage drawn by a grey pony, a small grey pony. And we looked at each other and we said, you know, this is the end. This is the Lady of Law's grey pony. And I didn't think at the time that I was to be in the final chapter of the history of Breadalbane, when in about 2 years' time I travelled with that grey pony sitting in the groom's box, in a horse box, in the groom's seat in a horse box, and looking after the pony until we arrived at North Berwick. Breadalbane had indeed gone over Glenogle, never to return.
So the McNabs were able to buy back Cannell and their burial ground above the Dochart at Culin, and look with pride again at their clan crest, the head of Nish, which a party of McNabs severed and bore back to Loch Tay. Look closely at the dead pine tree, and you'll see that it really is two trees. A branch of one has become grafted onto another. We're into the supernatural in this story. In 1680, the Lady of Lors prophesied that when a branch of a pine tree fell against the trunk of another and grafted itself on, that the McNabs would lose their lands. It happened 150 years later, and the tree died when the McNabs came back to possession. Untold thousands pass over the river bridge at Culin, but few notice the burial place of the McNabs just below it. The chief is with me now, on this yellow island Inchbuoy in Gaelic, where 3 rows of McNab chiefs give count of the centuries. James McNab of McNab explains its significance for the clan.
It has been a burial ground certainly since the 1500s, and it is a very special place for the McNabs. Francis McNab, the 16th chief, who, as you may know, was reputed to have had many children in Culin, although he was never married. He did once propose, and in his proposal he said that he had the most beautiful burial ground in the Highlands. It is a very special place. It goes back, as I say, to the early 1500s as a burial ground. My great uncle is buried here. Francis himself is buried here. In 1823, Archibald, who was Francis's nephew, the 17th chief, unfortunately inherited an estate which was heavily encumbered, and he was unable to retain it and had to flee his creditors to Canada. And the principal creditor was Breadalbane, to whom the property was conveyed, I think, in 1825. In 1948, my late uncle Archibald Corrie MacNab, the 22nd chief, acquired the property, and although I have had to sell Cannell, I still own this island and a few acres around Culin, but I'm in the process of trying to set up a trust so that the island, which is really the focal point for the clan, scattered as it is all round the world in France, Canada, Australia and many other places, this is the focal point, and we want to try and arrange for it to be in the possession of MacNabs in perpetuity.
Normal people can't see into the future, but in Breadalbane the past is always present, from the relics of St Fillan to abandoned castles like Finlarrig. Archimackerricher is steeped in it.
The last Marquess, who died in 1922, asked to be buried out here in the courtyard at Finlarrig and not in the old mausoleum where lie 7 knights, 3 earls and 2 marquesses of the House of Breadalbane. He had sold Taymouth the year before, and he knew that on his death the marquessate would become extinct, and he asked that he and his wife would be buried here facing west towards Argyll and Kilchurn, from which this remarkable family had sprung, and from where they had created this vast empire without a natural clan following at all, simply by sheer shrewdness of the earlier and more ruthless people. But on his death, the marquessate became extinct, and the title then reverted to a Scottish earldom. And the present holder of the title is now an elderly bachelor living somewhere in London. He has no heirs, and there are no heirs to succeed. And it seems likely that on his death, the curse of Breadalbanes and the prophecy of the Lady of Lors will be fulfilled.
Reflect that when the Breadalbanes lived here, their lands were so vast they could ride 100 miles north and south and 50 miles east and west without leaving their own estate. The 4th Earl, who became the first Marquess, was loved and mourned at his death in 1834. The 2nd Marquess, the one who had entertained Queen Victoria, had only 2 years before evicted 500 crofter families. He died unmourned in Switzerland. From Kenmore to Benmore, the land is all the Marquesses. The mossy house, the heathery knowes, and ilka bonny park is his. The bearded goats, the toosy stoats, and all the braxy carcasses. Ilka crofter's rent, ilka tinker's tent, and ilka collie's bark is his. The muircocks craw, the pipers blaw, the gillies' hard day's work is his. From Benmore to Kenmore, the world is all the Marquesses. These lines were written by one of Breadalbane's evicted tenants. And there was an unpublished verse which went like this: Breadalbane's land, the fair, the grand, will no be aye the Marquesses.